There is a particular silence that lives only in the workshops of men who traffic in illusion. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of concentration so absolute that the air itself seems to hold its breath. In a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Rotterdam, Elias Vos had cultivated that silence for 37 years. The space was a cathedral of deception. Canvases in various stages of birth and rebirth leaned against every wall. Jars of pigment lined shelves like apothecary bottles, each label written in a code Elias had invented in his 20s and never taught to another living soul. The windows were painted black, not out of paranoia, but because natural light is a liar. It changes. It betrays. And Elias Vos had spent his entire adult life learning how light could be commanded, manipulated, and ultimately enslaved to the purposes of the copy. He was not a criminal in the conventional sense. He had never stolen a painting. He had never broken into a museum. What Elias did was far more subtle and, in certain circles, far more valuable. He created paintings that had never existed but were then inserted into the historical record as if they had. A lost Vermeer study, a preparatory sketch by Rembrandt, previously unknown, suddenly discovered in the attic of a deceased collector. A small Caravaggio painted during the artist's fugitive years in Sicily, authenticated by experts who had no idea that the man they were authenticating was still alive and mixing lead white in a Dutch warehouse. Elias didn't forge signatures. He forged provenances. He forged the very memory of art history. And for the last 8 years, he had not worked alone. Maren Dekker was 26 when she first knocked on his door. She had arrived with a portfolio of technical drawings that demonstrated a draftsman's eye and a forger's patience. But more than her skill, Elias had recognized something else in her, a hunger. Not the hunger of the ambitious student who wants to surpass the master, but the hunger of the abandoned child who wants to be chosen. Maren's mother had died in childbirth. Her father had been a fisherman who drowned when she was 7. She had grown up in the institutional architecture of foster care, where the walls were always painted the same shade of institutional beige and where no one ever kept the promises they made on intake forms. She had learned early that the only permanence in the world was the permanence you created yourself. Elias understood this because he had been that child. He had been abandoned in a different way by parents who were present but vacant, who moved through their Amsterdam apartment like ghosts haunting a house they had never fully inhabited. He had found his family in the old masters, in the way their brushstrokes spoke across centuries with a directness that living people seemed incapable of. When he looked at Maren, he saw not an assistant, but an heir, not a student, but a daughter. He taught her everything, the chemistry of aging canvas, the particular way Vermeer ground his lapis lazuli, the microscopic cracking patterns that genuine centuries created, and how to replicate them using a combination of heat, humidity, and controlled oxidation. He taught her how to think like a painting, to become the medium rather than merely the hand that applied it. For 8 years they worked in the black-windowed warehouse, and the outside world receded until it became little more than a rumour. Maren learned to cook for 2. She learned which records to play during the long drying periods between glazes. She learned that Elias took his coffee black, except on Sundays, when he allowed himself a single sugar cube as a concession to the divine. She learned that his hands, which could replicate the trembling confidence of a 17th century brushstroke, shook when he spoke of his own mortality. And she learned, most importantly, that Elias was preparing her for something larger than mere apprenticeship. He was preparing her for succession. The project had begun 3 years earlier. Elias called it his magnum opus, though he never spoke the words aloud. It was to be a Vermeer, not a copy of an existing work, but a lost Vermeer, a painting that would fill a gap in the artist's known biography, a work from the so-called missing years between 1672 and 1675, when historical records suggested Vermeer had been working on a commission for a Catholic patron in Delft, who had died before paying for it. Elias had constructed the entire historical edifice. He had invented the patron, a silk merchant named Peter van Rijn. He had created correspondence. He had even commissioned a cabinet maker to construct a period-appropriate frame, which he then aged using a proprietary solution of vinegar and iron oxide. The painting itself was nearly complete. A woman reading a letter by window light, the signature Vermeer motif, but executed with a melancholy that Elias claimed was the product of the artist's awareness of his own impending death. It was, by any technical standard, a masterpiece, and it was to be Maren's introduction to the world. Elias had planned the unveiling with the precision of a military campaign. The painting would surface at a small estate sale in Belgium, mixed in with mediocre 19th century landscapes. A sharp-eyed dealer would notice it. Authentication would follow. The art world would be stunned. and Maren, operating under a carefully constructed alias, would be positioned as the discoverer, the young conservator who had recognised the work's significance. She would gain entry to the highest circles of the art market. She would have access to collections, to dealers, to the private archives that documented the movement of masterpieces across centuries. And from that position, she and Elias would operate on a scale that dwarfed anything they had attempted in the Rotterdam warehouse. He told her this on a Tuesday in October. The black-painted windows showed nothing of the autumn outside, but Elias had marked the date on his calendar, a small ritual he performed for all significant announcements. They sat at the workshop table, surrounded by the smell of turpentine and linseed oil, and he laid out the plan as if it were a map to buried treasure. Maren listened. She asked questions. She took notes in the leather-bound journal Elias had given her on her first anniversary in the workshop. And when he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were stained with umber and ochre, the permanent pigments that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. Elias looked at those fingers and felt a warmth that he had not experienced since his own mentor. A man named Heinrich Baum had placed a sable brush in his palm and told him that art was the only immortality worth pursuing. He did not know, in that moment of paternal pride, that Maren had already made contact with a dealer in Geneva. He did not know that she had already photographed the unfinished Vermeer using a camera concealed in the lining of her coat. He did not know that she had spent the previous 6 months constructing a separate identity, not as the discoverer of a lost masterpiece, but as the sole authenticator of a new one. And he did not know that the plan she was about to execute would not include him at all. The betrayal, when it came, was not sudden. It was not a knife in the dark or a slammed door. It was a slow turning, like the rotation of the earth, so gradual that by the time you noticed the shift, the sun had already set on everything you thought you knew. The completion of the Vermeer took another 4 months. Elias worked with a fervour that Maren had never seen before, a kind of religious ecstasy that translated into brushstrokes of devastating precision. He painted the woman's face last, as was his custom, because the face was the soul of the work, the point at which technique surrendered to something beyond mere skill. When he finally set down his brush and stepped back, tears were running down his face. Not from joy exactly, but from the recognition that he had reached the summit of his abilities, and that the only direction remaining was downward. Maren watched him cry. She had learned to read his emotions the way a sailor reads the sky, and she recognized this particular storm. It was the grief of completion, the mourning that accompanied every act of creative consummation. She handed him a cloth. She poured him a glass of the Jenever they kept in the workshop for celebrations. She sat beside him, and together they looked at the painting in the controlled illumination of the halogen lamps. The woman in the window seemed to breathe. The light on her face was not painted light, but actual light, captured and imprisoned in oil and pigment, waiting for a viewer to release it. "It's ready," Elias said. His voice was hoarse. "Yes," Maren agreed. They spent the next week preparing the painting for its artificial journey through time. Elias applied the final aging treatments, creating a network of craquelure so fine and authentic that it would withstand electron microscope analysis. He constructed the false provenance documents, aging the paper using a solution of tea and hydrogen peroxide, distressing the edges with sandpaper and careful burning. He wrote the letters from the fictional Pieter van Rijn in a hand that matched known examples of 17th century Dutch mercantile script. Every detail was perfect, because Elias Vos did not know how to be imperfect. Maren assisted in all of this. She mixed the solutions, she prepared the papers, she maintained the humidity levels in the climate-controlled chamber where the painting rested between treatments, and all the while, she was memorizing. Not the techniques, she already knew those, but the specifics of this particular deception, the chemical formulas, the document sources, the names and dates and addresses that formed the lattice of the lie. She was not learning in order to assist. She was learning in order to replicate. On the night before the painting was to be transported to Belgium, Elias fell asleep at his desk. He had been working 18-hour days for 3 weeks, and his body finally claimed the debt. Marna stood over him for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of his chest, the grey stubble on his chin, the ink stains on his fingers that had never fully washed away in all the years she had known him. She felt something then, a flicker of hesitation so sharp it was almost physical, but she had spent her entire life being abandoned, and she had decided long ago that she would never again be in a position where someone else could close the door. Elias had taught her that the only true power was the power to create reality. And now she was going to create her own. She took the keys from his pocket. She opened the safe behind the false panel in the supply closet. Inside were the provenance documents, the authentication certificates Elias had already prepared under his alias as a retired academic, and the contact information for the Belgian estate sale organizer who had been carefully cultivated over 2 years. Maan photographed everything. She replaced the documents exactly as she had found them. She returned the keys to Elias's pocket, and then she walked out of the warehouse into the Rotterdam night, carrying nothing but the knowledge in her head and the determination in her chest. The next morning, Elias woke to find the painting gone. Not the Vermeer, that was still in the climate chamber, waiting for transport. But Maren was gone. Her apartment, a small flat above a bakery 3 blocks from the warehouse, had been emptied in the night. Her phone number was disconnected. Her email accounts had been deleted. She had vanished as completely as if she had never existed, leaving behind only the faint smell of her perfume, a particular blend of jasmine and amber that Elias would associate with loss for the rest of his life. He did not panic immediately. He told himself there was an explanation, a family emergency, a sudden illness. He spent 3 days trying to contact her through every channel he knew. On the 4th day, he received a package. Inside was a newspaper clipping from a Swiss art journal, dated 2 days prior. It announced the discovery of a previously unknown Vermeer found in the private collection of a deceased Geneva industrialist. The painting was described in detail that matched Elias's work exactly. The authentication had been performed by a young conservator named Marie-Claire Duval, a name Elias did not recognise but whose credentials, according to the article, were impeccable. Elias read the clipping 12 times. Then he read it again. The painting had not yet been publicly unveiled, but it had already been sold, privately, to a Qatari royal family member, for a sum that the article described only as historic. The estate of the fictional industrialist was represented by a Geneva dealer named Anton Brecht, and the conservator who had discovered and authenticated the work was scheduled to give a lecture at the Fondation Biella in 2 weeks. Elias understood then. He understood with a clarity that was almost beautiful in its cruelty. Maan had not stolen the painting. She had stolen the plan. She had taken everything he had taught her, everything he had entrusted to her, and she had executed the deception without him. She had cut him out not because she needed to, but because she could. Because the ultimate forgery was not the Vermeer, but the relationship itself. The apprenticeship, the daughterhood, the love. He sat in the black-windowed warehouse for 3 days without eating. He stared at the empty space where the Vermeer would have hung if it had been real, and on the 4th day he began to paint. Not a Vermeer, not a copy. Something else entirely. A painting that did not yet exist, but that would exist soon enough. A painting that would be Maan Dekker's undoing. 18 months passed. In the art world, this is both an eternity and a heartbeat. The Vermeer, now officially titled Woman Reading by Northern Light, had been accepted by the leading authorities. It had been exhibited in Doha, then Paris, then New York. It had graced the cover of 3 major art magazines. Maren Dekker, operating as Marie-Claire Duval, had become a sensation. She was profiled in the New York Times as a wunderkind of conservation, a brilliant young woman who had revolutionized the field of pigment analysis. She gave lectures at the Louvre, at the Prado, at the National Gallery. She wore clothes that cost more than Elias's entire yearly budget for materials. She lived in a penthouse in Geneva with windows that looked out over the lake, windows that were not painted black, but were instead floor-to-ceiling sheets of crystal that admitted every variation of natural light. She should have been happy. She had everything she had ever wanted. Power, recognition, financial security so absolute that she would never again have to worry about being abandoned by anyone, because no one abandons a person who can make them rich. But happiness, Maan was discovering, was not a condition that could be forged. It required an authenticity she was no longer sure she possessed. The doubts began with a letter. It arrived at her Geneva apartment in an envelope with no return address, postmarked Rotterdam. Inside was a single photograph of a painting. It showed a woman in a dark room, illuminated only by the screen of a laptop computer. The style was unmistakably Vermeer in its treatment of light, but the subject was anachronistic, impossible. A 17th century master painting, a 21st century scene. The woman in the painting was Maren, or rather it was a woman who looked exactly like Maan, down to the small scar above her left eyebrow that she had received in a childhood bicycle accident. She was sitting at a desk, surrounded by forged documents, and she was weeping. The tears on her face were rendered with a technical precision that made Maan's breath catch in her throat. In the lower right corner, barely visible, was a signature. Not Vermeer's, Elias's, but not Elias Voss. A new name, one she didn't recognize. Maren burned the photograph. She told herself it was a trick, a manipulation, a psychological game designed to destabilize her. But she could not burn the memory of the brushwork. She had spent 8 years studying Elias's hand, and she knew, with the certainty of a fingerprint analyst, that he had painted it. Which meant he was still working. Which meant he had not been destroyed by her betrayal. Which meant, most terrifyingly, that he was coming for her. The second letter arrived a month later. This time it came to her office at the Fondation Baylor, slipped into her locked desk drawer by means she could not determine. It contained another photograph. The same woman, the same room, but now she was standing at a window, looking out at a city that was clearly Geneva. In her hand was a document that Maren recognized immediately. It was the provenance certificate for the Vermeer, the one Elias had created for Peter van Rijn. But in the painting, the certificate was burning. The flames were painted with such realism that Maren could almost feel the heat. A note accompanied the photograph, written in Elias's precise architectural hand. A forgery is only as strong as the story that supports it. I taught you how to build the story. I did not teach you how to survive its collapse. Maren hired security. She changed her routines. She had her apartment swept for listening devices and found nothing. But the letters continued, arriving at irregular intervals, each one containing a new painting, each painting advancing the narrative of her destruction. The third showed her being escorted from a building by police. The fourth showed her in a courtroom weeping while a judge pronounced sentence. The fifth showed her hands, her actual hands, mixing pigments in a prison workshop. The progression was unmistakable. Elias was painting her future, and he was painting it with the same technical perfection he had brought to the Vermeer. She tried to find him. She hired private investigators in Rotterdam, in Amsterdam, in every city where she knew he had contacts. But Elias Voss had vanished as completely as she had once vanished from his life. The warehouse had been sold, his bank accounts had been closed. He had become, in the language of his own trade, a lost master, existing only in the work he produced and in the terror he was carefully cultivating in her mind. The sixth painting arrived on the morning of the Christie's auction. Maren had consigned a small collection of discovered works, pieces she had authenticated and brought to market through her network of wealthy collectors. The auction was expected to generate over $40 million. It was the culmination of her career, the moment when Marie-Claire Duval would be recognized as the most significant figure in the art market since Bernard Berenson. The painting that arrived was different from the others. It was not a photograph, but an actual canvas, delivered in a wooden crate to her office. It was small, no larger than a sheet of notebook paper. It showed a simple scene, a hand holding a paintbrush. The hand was old, spotted with age, but the brushwork was confident. In the background, out of focus, was a figure hanging from a rope. The figure wore Maren's face, and beneath the image, in letters that seemed to have been scratched into the paint rather than applied with a brush, were coordinates, latitude and longitude, and a time. 14. The following day. Maren understood the message. Elias was not going to expose her through letters. He was going to expose her in person, and he had chosen his stage with the same care he had once brought to the construction of false provenances. The coordinates led to a location in the Swiss Alps, a remote cabin accessible only by a single mountain road, isolated enough for a private conversation and far enough from any authority to ensure that conversation would not be interrupted. She should have gone to the police. She should have taken the painting to her security team and demanded protection. But Maren was not a woman who ran from confrontation. She was a woman who had built an empire on the willingness to look directly at what others turned away from. And some part of her, the part that had once been a foster child staring at a beige wall, wanted to face the man she had betrayed. Not to apologize, not to explain, simply to see him, to know that he was real, to measure the cost of her victory against the wreckage she had left behind. She drove herself. She told no one where she was going. She left her phone in Geneva, carrying only the coordinates and a pistol she had purchased 3 days earlier from a man in a parking garage who had asked no questions. The mountain road was treacherous, slick with late spring snow, and she drove with the concentration of a surgeon, her hands tight on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the switchbacks that climbed toward the tree line. The cabin was exactly where the coordinates indicated. It was small, wooden, smoke curling from a stone chimney. A single window glowed with warm light, and parked beside it was a vehicle Maren recognized. a 1987 Citroën van, rusted at the wheel wells, the same vehicle Elias had driven to the warehouse every day for the 8 years she had known him. She had teased him about it. She had offered to buy him a new car. He had refused, saying that some things should not be replaced simply because they were old. Maren parked. She checked the pistol. She walked to the door. And before she could knock, it opened. Elias looked smaller than she remembered. Age had compressed him, or perhaps she had simply grown in the intervening time, expanding to fill the space his absence had created. His hair was entirely white now, cut close to the skull in the manner of a monk. His hands, when he gestured her inside, were steady, steadier than they had been in Rotterdam, as if the act of pursuing her had restored some vital current that her betrayal had interrupted. The cabin was a miniature version of the warehouse, canvases everywhere, pigment jars on every surface, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine so thick it was like walking into a memory. But there was one difference. In the centre of the room, on an easel illuminated by a single halogen lamp, was a painting Maren had never seen. It was large, nearly 2 meters in height, and it showed a scene of such technical complexity that she stopped breathing when she saw it. It was a courtroom. Not a modern courtroom, but a Dutch courtroom of the 17th century, rendered in the style of a group portrait by Frans Hals. The judges sat in their black robes, their faces individually characterized with the loose, confident brushwork that Hals had perfected. The accused stood in the centre, a woman in a simple dress, her head bowed, and surrounding her in the gallery were the faces of every person Maren had deceived. The Qatari royal, the Belgian estate organiser, the directors of the Foundation Biela, the journalists who had profiled her, the collectors who had paid millions for her authentications. They were all there, rendered with a specificity that could only have come from photographs, their faces twisted in expressions of judgment and betrayal. And in the centre, where the accused stood, was Maren's face. But it was not the face of Marie-Claire Duval, the confident conservator. It was the face of Maren Dekker, the abandoned child. The face she had not seen in a mirror for 3 years, because she had surgically removed it along with her identity. "I've been working on it for 14 months, Elias said. His voice was quiet, conversational, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her destruction. "It's called The Judgment of the Forger. I thought about titling it The Education of Maren Dekker, but that seemed too sentimental." Maren's hand was in her pocket, gripping the pistol. But she did not draw it. She could not stop looking at the painting. It was, objectively, the greatest work Elias had ever produced. It had the energy of Howells, the psychological penetration of Rembrandt, and something else, something that belonged only to Elias, a quality of moral weight. The painting did not merely depict judgment, it enacted it. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was barely audible. Elias moved to a workbench and began cleaning a brush. "You think this is about revenge. It's not. Revenge is a transaction, a debt paid. This is about restoration. You damaged something when you left, Maren. Not my business, not my reputation. You damaged the idea that I could trust anyone. And I have spent my life creating things that outlast trust. So I decided to create something that would outlast you." He turned to face her. His eyes were the same colour she remembered, a pale grey that seemed to reflect light rather than absorb it. "The painting will be delivered to the Swiss authorities tomorrow, along with the original provenance documents for the Vermeer. The ones you photographed, the ones I kept copies of. The chemical analysis will show that the painting is modern. The documents will show that you created them. And this painting, this group portrait, will show that I knew, that I tried to warn the world, that I was the whistleblower, and you were the criminal." Maren felt the floor shift beneath her. "You'll be destroyed too. You painted the Vermeer. You're as guilty as I am." Elias smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was the smile of a man who had already accepted the terms of his own destruction. "Yes, I will be destroyed. I will go to prison. I will die in a cell, probably within 5 years, given my heart condition, but I will die as Elias Voss, the man who created beauty and was betrayed by his student. You will die as Marie-Claire Duval, and then as Maren Dekker, and then as a number in a Swiss penal registry, and no one will remember you, because I will have painted your absence into history." Maren drew the pistol. Her hand was shaking. She pointed it at Elias, then at the painting, then back at Elias. He did not flinch. He did not raise his hands. He simply looked at her with an expression that was almost loving. The same expression he had worn when he told her she was ready to inherit his legacy. "You won't shoot me," he said. "Not because you're merciful, but because you know I'm right, and because some part of you, the part that sat in this workshop for 8 years and learned to see, wants to know how the story ends. Maren stood in the cabin, the pistol heavy in her hand, the smell of oil paint surrounding her like a judgment. She thought of the beige walls of her childhood. She thought of the warehouse. She thought of the glass windows in Geneva and how they had admitted every kind of light except the kind that revealed the truth. She lowered the pistol. She placed it on the workbench. And she walked to the easel where she stood before her own painted face. And she wept. Not for what she had lost, not for what Elias had taken, but for the simple, devastating recognition that the only authentic thing she had ever created was her own destruction. Elias picked up the phone. He dialed a number he had memorized. And while Maren wept before her portrait, he spoke to the authorities in a voice that was calm, precise, and irrevocable. The restoration was complete. The forgery had been exposed, and the forger, at last, had been authenticated.